Welcome back to In Deep. Glad you're listening online or on We Act Radio in our nation's capital. I'm Angie Coiro. I was in my 20s when I first heard the phrase, salute the uniform. Now, I don't know if you heard that one. I think as pop jargon, that one's pretty much gone by, but the concept survives. Salute the uniform means to respect the office, if not the person in it. In the military, you may not think much of the particular general who's standing before you, but you observe a basic standard of respectful behavior in the name of, in the name of a couple of things. First, basic good manners, but also in the recognition that in such consistency of respect, in the ongoing recognition that the office itself has stature and importance beyond the qualities of the person occupying it at the moment, within there lies part of the structure of our society. The society creates the office, respects the office, thus the office can continue to serve the society. Now, once upon a time, or so I've been told, that applied to the White House. Does that still apply? This past week, we have seen an NHL player blow off White House honors for his team's Stanley Cup win. We've seen Arizona Governor Jan Brewer shaking her finger within inches of the chief executive's nose. Earlier this month, the Speaker of the Kansas House, Republican Mike O'Neill, passed along insults to the First Lady, referring to her as Yo Mama. That's okay, though, because O'Neill immediately offered the standard non-apology apology, to those who were offended, as opposed to those who got the joke, presumably. And we've been through some very nasty political crap in these last few years, and some of what's happened on the 2008 campaign trail and after that at Barack Obama's sins has been pretty stunning. One of those incidents I'm using as something of a touchstone in this hour's conversation occurred in September 2008. The president was addressing a joint session of Congress about health care. He was in the midst of saying that despite claims that the reform effort will ensure illegal immigrants, quote, this too is false. The reforms I'm proposing, he said, would not apply to those who are here illegally. And a voice rang out, you lie. That mouth belonged to Republican Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, still serving, by the way. And I remember when I heard that, I remember my gut just clenching. I knew, my God, did he just do that? You don't do that. That's not just your nemesis, Barack Obama, who you have promised to defeat by any means. That is the President of the United States addressing the Congress and by extension the entire country. You don't do that. But, what would I have given any time after 9/11 on any occasion where George W. Bush was lying about weapons of mass destruction, lying about torture, lying about war profiteers, lying about Jessica Lynch, lying about extraordinary rendition? What would I have given for anyone in elected office to stand up and scream, you lie? Because what is decorum? What is politeness where war and death in human lives are concerned? Now, could Joe Wilson say the same thing? In a way, is it defensible at all? Could he say, well, look, the case that healthcare resources for Americans and the citizenship status of who we take care of are more important than the official niceties of how you treat the president? Is that different? Why is that different? So we're going to talk about civility and public discourse this hour. Joining me in a few minutes will be Norman Solomon. He's running for a newly drawn congressional district, District 2 in Northern California. Longtime activist with experience as the targeter and the targetee in political discourse. We talk first, though, with the Reverend Cassandra Dahnke. She and Thomas Spath formed the Institute for Civility in Government more than 10 years ago. And that grew out of trips the two of them led to Washington for members of their church group. They discovered in these conferences the need to teach people how to advocate a point of view with respect, but without backing down. Joining us from Texas, we have on the line the Reverend Cassandra Dahnke. Reverend, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, it's a delight to talk to somebody who's investing time and energy into increasing civility in the public discourse. Can you tell me what sparked you and your co-founder to do that?
What we picked up on is that within our society, we don't cultivate the skills necessary to engage in meaningful dialogue when we know we disagree. Mm-hmm. We just don't know how to do that as a people. That's just not generally taught or practiced or fostered. And so what my colleague Tom and I spent most of our time on the conference doing was helping people speak and listen to one another in a serious, non-confrontational way. And we always told people, don't give in just to get along, which is so easy to do, particularly in a group like that. You can sit back and silently think to yourself, well, this isn't really what I think, but I'm not going to say anything,
We know what's fascinating about that is, and I thought of you as I was listening to the radio within the last 24, 48 hours. I was hearing a program from Public Radio, and it was This American Life, and they were going into depth about what went so wrong with the euro. One of the elements of the conversation that stood out to me, because I knew you and I were going to talk, is the conversation around when it was clear the economy of Greece was going to be a big problem, and it literally did not get discussed because everyone was too polite to discuss it. It would have been considered confrontational and rude to say, hey, your economy is in really shabby shape and it might sink the euro. So out of politeness, we're looking at I'm exaggerating a bit, but out of sheer politeness, we're looking at the economic collapse of Europe. There's got to be a better way.
So many times in conversation, people do choose the easy way out. They choose to be polite. They choose not to say anything. And they go home and they think to themselves what they, would have said aloud had they been completely honest. But we don't like confrontation, so many of us. We don't know how to handle it. And we tend to immediately think that if there's a confronting going on, that it's negative. That we tend not to put that as a positive thing. When you hear the word, there's going to be a confrontation, your mind immediately thinks there's going to be a fight.
Well, and of course, the flip side of that,
there's going to be a fight.
We're seeing more fighting. We are seeing more fighting. We're seeing, for example, as I introduced the show, we played a clip of John McCain, who very gracefully handled someone in his audience insisting that Obama was an Arab. But then we also have Joe Wilson shouting out, "You lie," to President Obama during the State of the Union speech. And people are so angry that it seems that whatever issues they might have about confrontation, that they wait until it boils over and then they spill out.
And that's where we are lacking the skill set that we need to deal with our differences before they become out of hand. We always told folks at our conferences, claim where you are, because otherwise the position lacks integrity and you go home frustrated and angry. And I said, you've paid your own money, you've invested your own vacation, claim where you are. That's okay. It's okay to have differences of opinion. And folks took us at our word. So once we started trying to reach some kind of consensus on those conferences, it was really, really, really hard work. But they were always surprised at what they could find to agree on. They never agreed on everything. They didn't even come close to agreeing on everything. But they always found something they could agree on, and they were surprised by that. But they had to be able to talk to one another to discover what that was. And,
it's interesting. It's almost like we're talking about two different populaces, because the airwaves are so full of news footage of people screaming at each other. And we see a lot of politicians who are literally making money on the backs of overemphasized statements, on sometimes just plain insults back and forth. And you're talking about the contingency of not the politicians, but the electorate, who are shying away from confrontation. It just seems it's yet another gap that I hadn't heard of before. And I wonder if they're relating to the politicians who are screaming for them, if they feel disempowered.
I don't think so. I think that's why you hear so many people say they don't vote, they don't participate in the process, they don't want to be a part of it. They say it's too ugly, it's too dirty, it's too this, it's too that. I don't want any part of it. And that's why the Institute's always said that civilization that has a low civic, the citizens aren't participating, or for whatever reason, and it's becoming increasingly polarized, is a society at risk. And that's what we've got right now. A lot of people who aren't participating, and the ones who are very polarized. And so I firmly believe that improving the tenor of public discussion will encourage people and welcome people back into that discussion. who aren't participating now.
I'm talking to Cassandra Dahnke. She is one of the founders of the Institute for Civility in Government. And our topic this hour is whether some of these discussions can be conducted civilly, and if, in fact, there is a merit, a bonus for politicians who choose not to engage civilly. Later on, we'll be talking to Norman Solomon about his experiences on the campaign trail, his efforts to be civil, and when he feels it's okay to compromise the priority of being civil. And as we continue with Cassandra Dahnke, Cassandra, can you talk to me about your conversations with various politicians when you try to bring them to some form of agreement that civility can be a priority and can be an effective way to communicate?
Well, interestingly enough, many, many times when I'm talking with folks up on Capitol Hill, there is a hunger up on the Hill for civility. There is a strong desire, both among staff and among elected leaders, for civility. You wouldn't guess it.
No, you wouldn't guess it.
That's not what you would expect, but there is a genuine realization that civility is essential, is necessary, is a good thing. Unfortunately, many of them feel somewhat at a loss, partly because those voices they hear the most and those voices they hear the loudest are the ones who do not value civility and do not value any kind of compromise, any kind of consensus, any kind of give and take, any kind of listening almost. I hate to say that, but on both sides of the aisle, the loudest voices are the ones who are in the extreme.
Well, let me ask you, I've seen some of your presentations on the internet, and I invite anyone who wants to go to your website and check out your organization, the work that it's doing. It's instituteforcivility.org. And what I've seen on your website is you are a quiet, deliberate, intelligent, soft-spoken woman. And I wonder if the politicians who are telling you that, yes, civility is a priority, do you think they're shooting straight? Are they telling you the truth? Or is it, here's this nice woman who's trying to do a good job, we're going to make some nice words in her direction, but that's not really a priority for them? Are they being honest with you?
I think most of them are, because I've walked into offices where I've been told, well, my member's not the most civil person on the Hill. I mean, we hear both sides. I've had staff people who have been in tears speaking about their disillusionment, what they came to Washington to accomplish, and then what they found out it's really like. I've had members speak to me about, I would love to be civil, but I can't do that and get elected.
Right.
That's part of that's a whole nother dynamic. But they are beginning to realize that when they are not civil, when they use the attack ads, when they use the anger, when they tap into the negativity in order to get elected, because that's what American voters buy, and that's our part of the problem. The average citizens need to look at what their part of this problem is, and that is a big part of our problem.
That's a fascinating perspective as well, because we've been talking mostly about the politicians, but it's the people on the streets and the people in the front lines of the protests as well. With the Institute for Civility, I do want to emphasize for our listeners that you are a nonpartisan group. You speak neither for Democrats nor for Republicans, not for liberals, not for conservatives, but for civility. One of the issues that comes up with that is we can often see the incivility in the other guy, whereas for us, we feel what we're doing is justified. They're not going to listen to me unless I heckle. We have got to interrupt this guy because he is dangerous. If we stop and play this the nice way, we're not going to get anywhere. How do you address that?
A lot of people feel that way, and yet I have found that if you're serious about an issue, if you do your homework, if you approach people in an adult fashion, in a civil fashion, in a respectful fashion, and offer them information and insights that they might not already have, then they will listen. They will listen. It's interesting. One time I was being trained to be a substitute teacher, which is something that I tried for a very short time, and I really enjoyed my time in the classroom, but did not continue it for terribly long. But someone had given me a tip about uncontrollable classrooms, and they had said, when you're really losing control, whisper.
Oh.
And, you know, I tried it because I was in a high school history class, and the kids weren't paying any attention, and I just dropped my voice, and all the kids got quiet because they had to get quiet if they were going to hear what I was going to say. And I was amazed at how well that worked. I was absolutely stunned. But, you know, some of that same truth goes with speaking in the public square. I mean, we can keep yelling louder and louder and louder and louder, but if we have to yell that loud to be heard, then something is really, truly wrong with our message, with our method, with the system. There is space for quiet voices, and they can be far more effective than many of us know.
Actually, you're on the verge of anticipating my last question for you, and that is that it's easy to find people who say that civility in Washington, D.C., but also in discourse throughout our country, is irretrievably broken. And by the very fact that you work doing the work that you do, you have hope that this can be changed. What gives you the hope that this can be changed?
I have a lot of hope that this can be changed. First of all, because there's a real hunger for it. I don't think people realized how important civility was until we lost it. It's one of those classic things that you don't know what you have until it's gone. And now they're realizing how important civility is, and they are hungry to get it back. I hear story after story after story, not just in politics, but in daily life, where people are hungry for civility. That means that they will work for it. And the part of what the Institute is doing, yes, we teach civility skills to folks, and that's an important piece of what we do. But we're also a membership organization so that we can build a citizens movement for civility and actually shift the culture from one of polarization and antagonism and confrontation to one where civility is the norm. And it is politically expedient to be civil, and it is socially expedient to be civil. And, you know, that's something that we can accomplish in a relatively short period of time, say 20 years. We can do this. This is not rocket science. This is just a matter of the people deciding they want it badly enough that they're willing to raise their voices and say yes.
The Institute for Civility has published a book called Reclaiming Civility in the Public Square, 10 Rules That Work. You can find information on their website, instituteforcivility.org. And the Reverend Cassandra Dahnke, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up next, Congressional candidate Norman Solomon on putting these principles into action on the campaign trail. I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep. Welcome back. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. My guest, Norman Solomon, is an activist, author, media critic, and now a candidate as well. So let's put this hour's ideas of political civility to him. Norman Solomon, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Angie.
You know, we just had a conversation with Cassandra Dahnke, who has formed an institute to promote civility in the public square, and specifically in Washington. One of the interesting things that she pointed out was that there are those who are very forward with their comments, who, you know, the ones who, for example, shout out, "You lie," in the middle of the presidential speech. And then there are the people in the electorate who are so averse to confrontation that they're literally sitting out the elections. All they see is the screaming and the yelling. Does that jibe with what you see on the campaign trail?
Well, there's really, of course, a wide range of folks, but a lot of people feel like there's too much conflict. There's some folks who feel like there's not enough, and the equanimity within which Democrats and Republicans often discuss issues, some folks find actually disturbing because they feel that there's too much willingness to not talk about principles and talk about simply, can't we all just get along? And so, you know, we all generalize at our peril, but I do think there is a strong feeling and I run into it a lot on the campaign trail. Why are those folks in Washington just fighting all the time? Why can't they actually concentrate on getting something done? And I think that a nuanced approach is important, because if all of the people in Washington under the Capitol Dome are getting along, we are in big trouble. I don't want a one-party system. I don't even want a party, one of the two parties, that is unanimous within itself, because you need dissent, you need discourse, and you need a willingness to challenge. On the other hand, having the verbal equivalent of food fights all the time doesn't get us anywhere either.
You know, the difficulty there is it does get people somewhere. I had made reference to Joe Wilson shouting out at the president, and whereas a good portion of the country said, you just don't do that when the president's talking. Yeah. That's tacky. On the other hand, he got a ton of money afterward. There's payoff for misbehaving.
Yeah, he played to his base, and the base came through with the cash register. On the other hand, his opponent also got, a big bounce as well. And it does, unfortunately or not, go back to a cliche, and sometimes cliches are true. If not all politics is local, a heck of a lot is, particularly when you talk about Congress. I really like something that President Obama said when he put it this way years ago: we can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think it sets the right tone, because we've got to be willing to disagree and be clear about ways that we have a different point of view, different perspective. But to be disagreeable to the point of just reflexive nastiness, that's a downward spiral, and I think we've suffered from that.
I find it interesting to watch two different sides on issues where things are polarized. For example, whether Barack Obama is, in fact, a legitimate citizen and a legitimate president of the United States. There's a polarity there. There are people who think he's not and people who think the others are crazy. One of the incidents, I should say, that comes to mind is when someone asked Barney Frank about that. And he said, in essence, I can't even talk to you. You've got the intellect of a dining room table. I mean, certainly that is a crude and rude thing to say to another human being. On the other hand, those of us who've had it up to here with the birthers were thinking, thank God, somebody finally said you people are nuts. Talk to me about the role of civility in that exchange.
Well, I think he should have said kitchen table instead of dining room table.
I knew you'd have the right answer.
But seriously, folks, I do think that sometimes the disgust that people feel spills over into polemics that, frankly, it might be therapeutic and it might play well with the peanut gallery and the amen chorus, and so we enjoy it, and that's true of those who are Democrats as well as Republicans when those representing our views go over the top. I'm not sure what it accomplishes beyond that, and certainly if the tables were turned, we wouldn't care for that. Now, I agree with Barney Frank. The questions become so absurd that you have to unpack the question, if not demolish it, before you can provide any sort of helpful response. And this is a problem, I think, that more broadly politicians and others do face when they have a question they encounter which has as its premise so much absurdity that if you accept the question, you're already in a corner that is sort of Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole. So sometimes you do have to say, stop. I'm not even going to go there because the question is in some fourth dimension that I don't think comports with reality.
You put me in mind of when I rewatched the tape this morning from 2008 when John McCain gently and politely confronted an audience member who spoke ill of the president. This was not the more prominent situation where the woman called him an Arab. This was a question from the same arena where a man was disparaging about the president. And McCain, to his credit, said, now, wait a minute. He is, in fact, he's a good man. He's trying to do what he believes is right. I think he would make a fine president. The audience began to boo, and he began to lose them. And he gave it the old college try and got back in there and said, but I would make a better one, and that's why I'm running. And then the crowd was back behind him again. Yeah. To me, that was beautifully illustrative of how it should have been handled, and yet it does say something that he was losing the crowd by virtue of doing that.
It does. It was one of McCain's best moments in the campaign, kind of the polar opposite of the one where he kept trying to say that his vice presidential running mate would make a well-qualified president. So you had the alpha and omega, the up and down of his campaign. it's tough to challenge your own base, but I think it's important to do that. I know I have that experience in the campaign I'm running here. I'm a progressive independent Democrat. Sometimes when I give public events, people at a town hall will say things or put forward a question that assumes things that I just think are not based in reality. One of them is the 9/11 inside job stuff. And I have to say, even at the risk of telling people who came in the door wanting to support me, I don't buy it. I don't buy this whole theory about somehow 9/11 was an inside job. And I think if we're going to have a constructive voice in politics, we've got to be willing and able to say, whether to journalists or sometimes our own supporters, I'm going to tell you what I think is true, not what you want to hear.
Don't you risk not getting elected by doing that? Don't you need as many constituencies as you can to get into the office and worry about sorting the rest out later?
Well, you need the votes, but I think not at the cost of going sideways and not making sense. So after a while, I think you've got to get up in the morning and say, this is what I believe. And I think it's essential 24/7, 365 not to pander because, I think it was Gina Lola-Bridges said, I don't tell lies because it's so tough to keep track of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the same could be said about pandering. If not for any other reason, politicians should realize once they just want to pander to the person or the audience that's talking to them or hearing them last, they're going to get tangled up in their own contradictions. So my attitude is, why not just be truthful all the time, say what you think, and at least you're going to be consistent. As Oscar Wilde said, be yourself. Everybody else is already taken.
Norman Solomon is running for Congress from the 2nd Congressional District, the new coastal district in the San Francisco Bay Area's North Bay. Norman, what do you see as the trend right now in the ad hominem attacks? We know that incivility has been growing. We've seen some ugly issues on the campaign trail. What's your sense of whether this is going up or down now?
I think it's escalating, if anything, partly because of the big money. When a couple can drop $5 or $10 million at the drop of a hat, a so-called super PAC. The Republican primary is at the presidential level. Unfortunately, not only in and of itself mind-blowing, but also it's sort of a role model for other candidates all too often. And I think that's being replicated at local levels, not everywhere. But the notion that if you can fill the airwaves or the mailboxes with enough pejorative material ad hominem attacks and so forth, that somehow that means your chances of winning increase. A lot of people buy that. I don't, because I think that after a while you just become part of the wallpaper that people get sick of. But you can't beat something with nothing. And if you want to defeat the sort of AstroTurf, my attitude is, well, wouldn't it be good and isn't it necessary to run from the grassroots? It's what we're doing, and people can find out more about that at solomonforcongress.com. And it's what candidates are doing throughout the country. It doesn't mean most of them will win. Most of them won't. But if you can put together grassroots support, realistic, pragmatist approach, and the political equivalent of business plan, and, yeah, you got to raise some money, if you've got a message that resonates, you have a real chance to win.
Tell me your experiences on the trail with any incivility you've encountered.
Well, a lot of it, interestingly enough, has come at fundraisers and house parties where 99+% of the folks are civil, but I had more house parties than all the other candidates put together because of the grassroots nature of the campaign. So we're talking several dozen house parties where I go, I talk with folks, I listen to them, and I've had a number of people approach me, sometimes with checkbook in hand, and say, I have one question to ask you, and I really, at this point, I'm very upset with you, and sometimes they'll throw in a pejorative or two, and they'll say, I have a question, and depending on how you answer it, I'm going to either write you a check or I'm going to walk out the door without doing so. And, it's a form of incivility because it's sort of like dangling a check in front of your eyes and demanding that you prove yourself, that they feel sometimes you're not serving their particular rhetorical or programmatic interests. And I've had that happen a number of times. And, when that person sometimes walks out the door without writing a check, I say, that's just fine. There are also people who just level ad hominem accusations. And here's one example. This one was amazing to me. Somebody came up to me a couple of weeks ago after debate and said, I don't trust you. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because you're wearing a suit, and that means you're a politician. And I said, well, I've never run for office before. I do wear a suit, but a lot of people wear suits. He said, no, that means you're a politician. That means you're a liar. And so, to me, I would put that in the uncivil category. It certainly doesn't move discourse forward.
But it's really revelatory of some of the mentality out there, the absolutes. It's very comforting to think in absolutes because it doesn't require you to think very far. And I think that's what a lot of the incivility plays on.
Yeah, it's sort of throwing down a gauntlet, but it's not on the basis of something particularly substantive. And the result is people don't have to actually have a dialogue. And let's face it, that can be challenging. It's sometimes a brain stretcher to actually listen to somebody and then respond to what they're saying, not what you think they're saying or wish they were not saying. And that cuts off any sort of meaningful communication.
Norman Solomon, when I attempt to introduce him in the middle of a segment, I'm always puzzled on how to do so because his list of credentials and accomplishments is longer than most people's arms. You're going to find all of it at solomonforcongress.com. One of the things you see there as you look at Norm's accumulated experience is, Norman, you've been something of a fearless activist, and the history of activism in the U.S. highlights a number of times when we've reached a fever peak, I think particularly the Vietnam War. And again, I think of the movement of rights for African Americans. And at those times, people worked the system until they felt the system was no longer working. And then they went into civil disobedience, and that began to accomplish things for them. One of the things I observe about discourse today is less of a reliance on testing the system first. Am I imagining that we have moved away from the point where we test the system first and then resort to disobedience or rudeness afterward?
I think there is more of a reflex to just say, tried that, did that, been there, done that, ain't going to do it anymore, even when it's hardly been tried in the first place. And, to all listeners, I would say, don't get me wrong. I believe in outside as well as inside the electoral system, political work all the time. I think we need an inside-outside at all times because you can't just work inside the system nor just outside it. That said, there's a real strong tendency now to assume a door is locked without trying the doorknob first, so to speak. And sometimes the system is more open, but it remains closed because we haven't jammed the door open or even tried it too much. And so I think that protests are often necessary but too exclusionary. And I'd like to see more discussion, including in the Occupy movement, of how we can continue to do the Occupy protests in the streets and so forth, and also, so to speak, literally occupy seats in Congress by doing the electoral work. And let's face it, going door to door and canvassing and organizing a campaign, it's sometimes very tedious, but nothing can be accomplished without that kind of work as well.
What about the phenomenon of the current running for office Norman Solomon confronting the younger activist Norman Solomon? What have you learned about how to reach out, how to make connections with people, how not to alienate people that maybe you wish you knew earlier when you were a young activist?
I think a lot of it for me could be described as getting beyond either or and getting to and it doesn't negate the need for protest, for challenge, for outrage, for acknowledging pain and resentment, but at the same time embracing that there's not just one system. There's a system that has so many different moving parts to it, and there's space within it. And so if I were to astral travel back 30 or 40 years ago and see myself as an activist, say 20, 25 years old, I would say, yeah, it's great, the principles that you're fighting for. Think more strategically and within that tactically about how we can move our values into legislation. How can we get people in public office who not only resonate with our values but will be responsive to us as constituents? And that means, I think, thinking more creatively and considering who's in the society. I mean, in our congressional district, all of them now, 700,000 people. That's a lot of folks. Let's be more creative about reaching out and building coalitions and moving in a progressive direction.
Are you prepared for things to be hurled at you or about you on the trail that either have a factual basis or not, but are just posited in a rude and hot sense when they could be cold and methodical. Is that the kind of thing you would call people on?
Like most congressional districts in this country, when push comes to shove in the last several weeks of an election, the mailboxes fill up and there's all sorts of mud that's thrown around. And as an independent progressive Democrat, I know I'm going to be a target of big corporate money. You know, the other leading candidate in the race, according to the polls, and by the way, I'm 5 points behind the front runner in this race right now, according to the latest poll in this campaign done by Celinda Lake. I know that the corporate forces behind my opponent, whether it's directly the campaign or more likely a 527 or, you know, some other concoction or super PAC, that they're going to denounce me all kinds of ways on TV and radio and in mailers. And I just think it comes with the process of running for office. I've had to accept it. Nobody likes to be trashed in public. And frankly, I made a list with campaign manager of things I could be attacked on. And there are dozens and dozens of them, and one or two of them are even true. And the rest of them are like just going to be convenient fabrications. That's just part of the process, unfortunately.
Was the suit on the list?
I don't think that'll be one of them. I have a really nice suit. I think it'd be hard to attack me on that one.
We're going to come back in the next segment, talk more to Norman Solomon, he is the 2nd District candidate in the North Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're speaking to our audience here on We Act Radio in Washington, D.C. Coming back with more in just a minute. I'm Angie Coiro. This is In Deep. Welcome back to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. We're talking to Norman Solomon about civility on the campaign trail. He knows all about that. He's running for California's 2nd District, a new district along the coast in the North Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. Norman, I hope you don't mind my using that San Francisco-esque introduction, but I think it's easier for our Washington office to. Yeah, I think we understand that you are a district unto yourself up there. But in talking about the civility on the trail, one of the things that I feel, and this is where my own bias is coming out, I feel that often the accusations from the right are disingenuous about whether what is true of the person that they are accusing is in fact true of them. One of my friends refers to them as the projection party, and I take, for example, the whole issue of class warfare. We have an economic system that has severely divided the classes. It has made the middle class disappear. And if you deign to point that out, you are accused of class warfare. And I think that some of the issues that get hurled back and forth on the trail, it's almost hard for a candidate to civilly, as you said earlier, unpack that and say, well, you know, here's the truth of that. You know, in essence, it would probably feel better just to say, how in the world can you call me a class warfare person when you're trying to give, you know, more to the 1% of the 1%? Are you following me on that? And what's your feedback on that?
Well, the Republican Party tends more to be the party of stereotyping, because they want to push pre-installed buttons, and frankly, the mass media have helped to install those buttons, the cliches, because within about 5 or 8 or 10 seconds, if somebody says, hey, we need to keep cutting taxes, we have too much class warfare going on, most people understand what they're talking about. It might take, you know, heaven forfend, 45 seconds or 2 minutes to actually have a more multidimensional response or answer. And you're reminding me, Angie, that this has been one of the frustrations as a candidate, to go to one debate after another. And I've been in half a dozen of them already, sometimes live on TV or radio, throughout this very sprawling district from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border here in Northern California, and to be told you're going to have 1 minute to respond to this question. And I understand time constraints and so forth, but it's not that far from soundbite land political requirements. And yes, we have to learn how to say things in 20 seconds, but when there should be the space in a 2-hour debate to have more time, it's really a challenge there, and it feeds into the bumper sticker politics. Let's throw the 6 words at somebody and leave them on the defensive.
I think one of the things that feeds into that is when you see the media coverage of these things, be it a debate or be it a speech, the media does tend to break it down into the horse racing instead of the issues. And I'm thinking of a newscast that I heard this morning where there was a review of a presentation that Barack Obama made, and they talked about the fact that he didn't specify who his opponent will be. in the general election. What he said about that opponent, what he said about the topics and the subjects that he and that opponent will have to wrangle over, didn't really get the coverage. It was, oh, did he mention who he's going to be running against? And that, I think, foments this attitude.
Well, I come into this race wearing a lot of hats, and it's the same head, just one head, but a lot of hats on it. One is media critic, And so I go back, having co-authored or written books like The Habits of Highly Deceptive Media or Unreliable Sources. And so having looked at news media coverage of social issues, including political races, for now several decades in an analytical way, I'm acutely aware now as a candidate for the first time what that's like to be running the largest campaign. We have 750 different volunteers. We have more than 3,000 different individual donors who've written checks or gone to SolomonForCongress.com and contributed by credit card. We have a historically large grassroots campaign. We're raising, I think, profound issues about gaps between the wealth of some and the sinking middle class or poverty of others, ecological crisis, what Dr. King called the madness of militarism, that and much more. And there are daily papers in the district, and just a few of them. And most of them will not cover issues at all. I mean, we've been in this campaign for a year. The ballots are going to drop in the mail here in, 3.5 months or so. We're getting pretty close as these things go to Election Day. And yet we've got daily newspapers that only substantively cover this election, with rare exceptions, when the quarterly FEC campaign contribution totals come out. Mm-hmm. Then they want to cover it. How much money has each candidate raised? And fortunately, we've raised a few $100,000, not the most, but we've raised it from the grassroots. But I empathize, actually, with some of my opponents who've raised relatively little, and they barely get mentioned in the story at all. They're in paragraph 12 or something. So what kind of news media will not cover issues but will cover money, and not in a critical way? They don't even say where the money's coming from, the corporate PACs or anything. They just give the dollar totals like they're toting up the ball scores.
This reminds me of Stephen Colbert's comment, in the guise of his speech in front of President Bush, where he says, I speak and you type. That's you being a reporter. And I don't want to slam all reporters. Some of them do work very hard to go beyond that. But you were talking about the soundbite. Regardless of the best reporters' best intentions, we really don't see, at least in the mainstream media, the established broadcast and print media, we don't always see the depth of coverage that we would like, the ability to unpack these issues. How much better or worse is the internet around that in encouraging the emphasis of nuance, the emphasis of facts and detail?
Well, in general, it's been better. Of course, the old computer precept from decades ago, garbage in, garbage out, still applies, and things on the internet can be just as garbagey as anywhere else. But at least the barriers to entry are lower. There are fewer gatekeepers. There's more of a capacity to hear from people unfiltered information and opinion, not fact-checked opinion, but at least people's perspectives. I think that's been helpful. So many journalists are constrained. They want to do a good job, and they are part of a loop that politicians and big money contributors to campaigns are, where politicians see what is or isn't getting covered how in the news media and begin to imitate the superficiality of reporters, and then reporters reciprocate, and it's just a downward loop. We've got to get out of that, and I think independent media, willingness to raise other issues, that's got to be a trail that we blaze, whether candidates or journalists.
Norman Solomon is running for office in California's 2nd Congressional District, and we're talking about issues of civility on the campaign trail. And as I discussed with my earlier guest, there had been an incident that was reviewed on This American Life that was really illustrative, Norman, of how you can go overboard in civility, and that was a discussion of the evolution of the euro, the decision to include Greece in the euro. And in the midst of this excellent episode, I should add, people should go check that out, but in the midst of it, one of the real nuggets was that when the weakness of the Greek economy began to emerge, everyone was too polite to point that out to Greece. They knew that they weren't getting all the economic facts that they could, but how rude it would be to say, I don't believe you, I need to see your numbers. Thus, they proceeded, with the euro as planned and with the progress of the euro. And it's a glaring example of the very high price of emphasizing being polite. One would assume, of course, that's not an issue on the campaign trail. But if you are a candidate who is trying to be a decent human being, it illustrates how you'd better pick your time and place to do that.
Oh, I think that's right. And I have been accused by my main opponent of being negative. And when I point out that he's taken $10,000 from AT&T while in the state legislature, $11,000 from PG&E, $8,000 from Gallo, this is, I think, sharing information. It's all factual. But what is information to one candidate or one side is scurrilous attack to the other. And I think that is unfortunate because it doesn't mean that we should all play nice just because we want to be civil. We should all be nicey nice and not want to ruffle anybody's feathers. If you're running for office and you don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers, you may just as well stay in bed and pull the covers over your head, because politics and elections should be about choice, and there are differences, and to paper over the differences, I think, would be, and often is, a big mistake. I think of the story, The Emperor's New Clothes, and sometimes you need that kid of any age to point out when the emperor has no clothes, and just because you're first or nobody else seems to have said it before, that doesn't change the necessity of doing it.
Well, let's talk about confronting the opponent on things. And one of the things I'm thinking about is the very well-prepared, very slippery, encoded arguments. And again, I go to Barack Obama, to President Obama, and some of the attacks on him. When you hear code words such as arrogant, which is a substitute for uppity, when you hear about whether he is in fact a citizen, which in some people's minds, frankly, is whether he is white enough, if you are to speak specifically about the underlying racism, then you have that plausible deniability argument flinging back at you. I didn't say anything about him being black. I'm talking about the way he's acting. And they're, in a sense, relying on your wanting to be a civil person and not hurl inaccurate accusations. That's an argument they win.
A lot of this, I think, trails back through the last couple of decades, because after the overt civil rights discrimination issues were resolved through not only the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and fair housing and so forth, in the last few decades, I think a different set of arguments kicked in, and one of them was fought during the 1980s primarily over affirmative action, over what some, even including Joe Klein and certainly George Will and John Leo and so forth, these fairly prominent pundits talked about what they called the culture of poverty, and there was a lot of sort of riffs about dependency on welfare, and that was coded. It was coded against people of color, particularly African Americans, often against poor women, and so that became the subtext. And then the right wing trotted out this term political correctness. And they used the term PC, political correctness, to beat people over the head when people would point out that we still have huge problems with racism in our society, individual and institutional. And the response was, whether these were so-called culture wars on campus or whatever, oh, you're just being politically correct. And it got so contorted during the 1980s and 90s that it was often considered worse to be accused of or even guilty of so-called political correctness, whatever that is, than to be accused of or culpable for racism. And I think we're seeing a new sort of generation of that now, and some of it's being utilized in the not-so-subtle attacks on President Obama to imply that to point out some of the racialist aspects of attacks on Obama is somehow to deflect real issues. No, we all have a right to criticize the president, and I certainly do in terms of policies. But to use innuendo to say that somehow he's not as American as other citizens or he's not a real citizen, I just think that's beyond the pale.
Norman Solomon's website is solomonforcongress.com, and we're talking about the priority of civility on the campaign trail. And Norman, let's talk about civility on the part of your supporters. One of the hardest things to ever do is to turn the focus on ourselves and say, am I behaving according to my own standard? And I have fallen into this reflection when I hear people who criticize the president. You know, if you can't respect the person, at least you respect the office. And the rejoinder to that is frequently, you didn't respect the office when George Bush was in there. My personal opinion was that George Bush led us into an unnecessary war for political gain in the service of a political agenda. But it does look different, doesn't it? When they're saying things about Obama and I'm saying things about George Bush, how do we look at ourselves and make sure that our own slate is clean, that we're not falling into behavior that we would reproach the other side for?
Well, it does look different, and in the other shoes is sometimes a hard transition to make. I think part of the problem is undue partisanship. When we identify so strongly with one political party, then it's the sort of, I guess, people biblically inclined would talk about pulling the mote out of one's own eye. But there are countless examples on Capitol Hill where, depending on who's in control of the House, the opposite argument is made by the same people. And we've had that about filibusters as well, or states' rights. And I think that sometimes we have to get to the moral core of the issue. Speaking of states' rights, we have a battle in this district. We have cannabis dispensaries that have been threatened with and have faced and experienced closure because Eric Holter and the Obama administration have gone back on their pledge, and they're shutting down these medical cannabis dispensaries. Well, people who are against that say, oh, that's about states' rights. And then other people with long memories say, hey, hold on a minute. We had Governor Wallace in Alabama talking about states' rights to protect racist Jim Crow policies. And to me, a way to avoid flip-flopping is to have a consistent standard. And in this case, just to digress, that means that, yes, we support states' rights when the state's right is being asserted to defend and increase civil liberties and civil rights. And when states' rights are being asserted to do that, as in the case of cannabis dispensaries, yes, we're going to fight the federal government encroachment, because by fighting that encroachment, we will defend state law and local law that is expanding human rights. On the other hand, if the state of Arizona is constraining and constricting and repressing human rights, such as this horrible racial profiling so-called immigration reform law, then we don't respect that state right. We want the federal government to intervene. I think if we're clear about our values and our real agendas, then our hypocrisy quotient hopefully will remain very, very low.
Hypocrisy quotient. I like that. I'm going to keep that one. I'm sure I'm going to use that. Let me raise the curtain on the background in the show a little bit for my last question for you. As I said, we spoke earlier with one of the co-founders of the Institute for Civility in Government, and we had originally been talking about having a panel discussion with the two of you on at the same time. And she would tell me her ideas about encouraging civility on the campaign trail, and I would talk to you about the reality of that. The person from outside and the person from inside. And although she understood in principle that's what we wanted to do, one of her concerns is that their group is a nonpartisan 501c3. It is very important for them not to be seen as being partisan. And because of the tenor in Washington, D.C. these days, her concern for her group was that even to appear on the air with someone who is actively running for office might taint their standing and their ability to talk to both sides. Some of that might strictly be a matter of paperwork. You don't go on the air with a person who's actively running for office. But I also had a sense that it had to do with, gosh, you can't even cross the street with a liberal these days in case you are painted as a liberal. Is that some of the reality that you've encountered?
Well, one of the ironies is that the 501c3 world, which is very important, and I've worked in that world for well over a decade, it is a framework that is crucial to improving our society. We've got probably millions of people directly involved in nonprofit organizations and projects. And yet, when elections come around, people are so much under pressure to not seem to push any envelope that they silence themselves. And it's perhaps a dangerous irony that the nonprofit world removes itself from part of the vital political discourse of our society, and I'm not sure that's totally by coincidence. I mean, I agree with those limitations and the laws, but sometimes it seems that some of the most vital nonprofit activists, organizers, and organizations are self-marginalizing themselves from the very discourse that's vital to the lifeblood of our political world.
Norman Solomon, it's always such a joy to talk to you, and I've had you on any number of shows that I've done, and it's a real pleasure to have you here on In Deep. Thank you for giving us so much time.
Oh, thank you, Angie.
Norman Solomon is running for California's 2nd District Congressional seat. You can find more information about him and his long history as a researcher and activist, a media critic, a public interest advocate, and an author. All of that is at solomonforcongress.com. We'll link that from our website, too. And that is our show for this week. Our executive producer is Gordon Whiting. Matt Fiddler is our engineer. Thanks to Peter James Callahan at We Act Radio, too. Our closing music, can you hear him in the background? That is David Gans. Opening and additional music this week by Big Troubles. If you'd like to hear more of the show, we encourage you to visit lftlc.com. I'm Angie Coiro. See you next week.
And a strange preoccupation with other people's private parts. They want us to do what they say, but I'd rather live my own damn way. We'll take our culture back someday, but it's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, but I know it's gonna get better.